Hello friends, my name is AJ and welcome to the third video of Carolina Analytics and Data Science's Introduction to Python for Data Science series. In this video, we're going to dive in a little bit more into numerical variables and work with some basic arithmetic, for example, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So without further ado, let's get started. Alright everyone, so here I am inside of a new Jupyter notebook, which has three sections here for the three different topics we're going to be talking about in this video. And the first thing that we're going to be going over is modifying variables. So what do I mean by modifying variables? Well, in the last video, we actually declared a variable called number of passengers, and this was equal to 255. Again, what does this mean? Well, if we go back to the original formula for a variable, or creating a variable, we have the name of the variable, we have the assignment operator, which is just the equal sign, and then on the right side we have a value. And again, what this does is that it takes a value and stores it inside of a new variable with the name that we provide. And then we can access this value by referring to the name later on. Now, that is very good to store information such as this, number of passengers equals 255. But let's say that this number needs to change, right? We have number of passengers. If I were to print the value of number of passengers here, and from the last video, if you do not remember, the print function, or putting print and then a variable inside of parentheses, basically outputs the value that is stored within a variable. So in this case, if I want to get the value out of the variable I created and I run the cell, you can see that the print statement gives me 255 because that is the value inside of my variable. And we can also, just for the sake of it, check the type of the variable. And we can do that again by using the type function. This was covered in the last video. So if I want to find the type of number of passengers, you can see it is an int. And the reason it is an int or an integer is because the value that is being stored here is a whole number. So now that we have this, let's say though that our number of passengers change. Let's say that all of a sudden there is 300 people who are boarding this plane. Must be a really big plane, right? So how do I actually change the value of a variable that already exists? Well, you can do this very simply by actually just saying number of passengers equals 300. And now you can see that if I were to print out the value of num passengers, you can see that the first time this variable says or gives a value of 255, and the second time the variable gives a value of 300. So all you have to do to modify a variable is simply overwrite it. You just you put the name on the left side, the same name as you had before, the assignment operator, or the equal sign, and then the new value on the right-hand side. And this is, of course, very, very useful. Obviously, variables need to change and need to be modified all the time. For example, if you're playing a game, I used this example in the previous video, but let's say you're playing a video game and you have a high score. Well, your high score is not going to remain constant. As you continue to play the game, your high score will increase. And when it does increase, you need to modify that value. And this, in a very basic sense, is how we modify our values. Now, we're actually modifying our values simply by making a new number, just choosing a new number and then setting the variable to this number. However, in certain cases, we might need to do math or to kind of figure out what values need to be equal to. And the entire point of even statistics and data science, a lot of it is based off of mathematical concepts. And math is also fundamental to programming, and it is very easy to actually do mathematical operations inside of Python. So here, we're going to be now learning how to actually do basic math that you would do either on a piece of paper, on a calculator, but do it inside of code. And the main few operations that we often work with are addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. All right, and we can use the following symbols to do all of these operations. So for addition, we can use the addition sign, which is just the plus. Now, how would I actually write this in code? Well, for example, let's say I wanted to create a value. Let's just call this my sum. And I'm going to set it equal to the sum of 8 and 7. I want to add these two numbers together. Well, to do this, in between my numbers, all I have to include is a plus sign, just like that. And now you'll see that I'm essentially, this is a bit different, right? Before, I was setting a variable to have a value that is already computed. Here, I'm setting my value seemingly to an operation, 8 plus 7. But how Python actually computes this is it will take these values, complete the operation, so add them together, and then store it into the variable. So you can see now that if I were to use the print statement and actually get the value out of my new variable, my sum, you will see that it returns 15 because the value stored inside the variable is going to be 8 plus 7, which is 15. Now, in addition, not only can you use values such as this, however, you can also use variables inside of your mathematical statements. So for example, let's say I want to say new passengers, and I want to take my original number of passengers, which in this case was modified to 300, and I want to add 20 more passengers to that. Well, I could say that my new variable, new passengers, is equal to num passengers plus 20. Because what it's doing is it's taking num passengers, which has the value of 300, and it's going to add 20 to it, which would be 320, and it's going to take 320 and store it as my new variable. So just like as you would in math, let's say you have, x plus 20 equals y, and then you say x is equal to 300, just like how you would substitute that value in, so it would be then 300 plus 20 equals y equals 320. That is the same principle that we're doing here. And now I can check my work by using the print statement on new passengers. And you can see that the value that it prints out here is 320 because it's taking number of passengers, which was defined up here, and adding 20 to it, and then taking this, which would be, again, 320, and saving it as this new variable, new passengers. Now, not only can you do addition, you can also do subtraction. And subtraction uses, well, the minus sign as its operator. That is, pretty convenient. So let's say I have so I'm going to say my difference, or I will kind of shorten this as diff. And I can use, let's say I want to subtract two numbers. I want to subtract 80 and 46. Or in this case, I just typed 56, so we'll go with that. Well, just like we use the addition operator up here in between our two numbers, we can use the subtraction operator. 80 minus 56. And now if I run this, it'll save the difference of 80 and 56 to my variable, my diff. And now I can display that value, the value of my new variable, by using the print statement. So I can say print my underscore diff. And if I run that, you can see that the value that is printed out is 24, which is 80 minus 56. And again, just like we did up here, where we added using other variables, we can do that with all of the other types of math as well, including subtraction. So let's say that I have smaller passengers, and let's say that two people had a last-minute issue and they needed to cancel their flight. Well, we can simply take the new passenger's value and subtract 2 from it and save it to the smaller passengers variable. And you can see that if I were to print out the value of my new variable, smaller passengers, right over here, if I were to run it, you can see now that the value is 318. And this is because my new passengers was 320 because it was num passengers 300 plus 20. And then you subtract 2 from it, and this saves as 318. Now, you can notice here that what I'm starting to do is I am using a variable, new passengers, which was also a computed value, off of a value up here. So you can see how I'm now beginning to use variables where the values that are actually being used here are often computed. So when you're actually checking your work or you're, working through code, you might have this where you're using a lot of previously computed values. So it's important to kind of conceptualize a little bit in terms of what this actually means, right? New passengers minus 2 is the same thing as num passengers plus 20 minus 2, because this goes over here, and num passengers is 300. Now, of course, when you're actually using these variables, this is not num passengers plus 20. This is saving as 320. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say I were to change my number of passengers midway through. So let's say I go here and I just type num passengers is equal now to 30. And if I run this again, you'll see that my value stays at 318. It doesn't dynamically change by changing my variables because it happens sequentially. Here, number of passengers, when I ran this line of code, num passengers was still equal to 300. So the value stored in new passengers is 320. And then down here, when I use it again, it stays 320. Just because I changed num passengers to 30 doesn't mean that this value up here is changed. So the way that math works is it is done sequentially, and that is very important to remember. If you need to change the value of your variables and you want to actually change your overall calculation, make sure you do it above your actual math and calculation, because it might not count the change that you make if you are changing the value after you are using it. So that is something to keep in mind. All right? And now we can move on to the next operation, which is multiplication. Now, unfortunately, multiplication is not x. It is actually the asterisk symbol right over here. Some people might already use this symbol to show multiplication on homework or in math class, but most people either use x or a dot. In this case, it is the asterisk. And we can do the same thing that we did over here. I can say my product. If I want to multiply the numbers 4 and 6, I can say 4 times 6, just like that. If I want to now print out my value, I can say print my product, and you can see down here that it gives me a value of 24, because 24 is the product of 4 and 6. And again, I can do the same thing. Let's say I want to multiply 24 times 2. I can say my new product is equal to my product, and then times 2. And I can print out this value right over here, and you can see that it gives me 48. So this is following the same things that we're doing up here, where we use other variables inside of our statements as well as just use numbers. And they work essentially the same way. Now I'll move on to division, and division is actually the slash right over here. It is the slash that is on the bottom right of your keyboard, and that denotes division. So I can do this by also saying, for example, my quotient. I'll just say my division in this case, but quotient works. I can say 9 divided by 2, and if I were to print out my division, you will see that it gives me 4.5. Now, this is something that is very important to understand. When you divide, right, oftentimes your data types could change. For example, let's say I have, 8 plus 7. Those are 2 integers, and when I add them together, when I add 2 integers together, my answer will be an integer. If I subtract 2 integers, then my answer will be an integer. If I multiply 2 integers, my product will also be 2 integers. However, with division, it doesn't necessarily work that way. I can have 2 integers, 9 and 2, and I divide them. However, the type of my answer, if I just type it out, will actually be a float, because now there is now the addition of a decimal place. So that is something very important to remember, that your data types will change if you're dividing 2 integers together. It might change to a float. Now, even if I go here and I do now 8 divided by 2, you can see that when I'm dividing two integers, even if the answer is an integer, it still changes to a float with a decimal point, 4.0. So if you're ever working with any data or any math where you need to have your answer as an integer, make sure that you realize that when you're dividing two integers like this, your answer will be in a float. So that is something to keep in mind. Division, because again, you are taking values and you're dividing them, it will not always be an integer, and Python will automatically turn it into a float for you, which is nice. Some programming languages won't do that, and let's say you do 9 divided by 2, which is 4.5, it'll just return the answer 4, because it's trying to keep it as an integer, because it doesn't automatically change types for you. But in Python, it will be the exact value that you are, I guess, expecting. So in addition to these, we can also talk about exponents, because that is probably important. And we use, instead of this symbol for exponents, we actually use 2 asterisks. 2 asterisks together will be an exponent in our case. So let's say I want to say my power, and I want to do 2 to the power of 3. Well, I can simply say 2, and then 2 asterisks, and then 3. If I were to print out now the value of the my power variable, you can see that it gives me 8, because 2 raised to the 3rd power is 8. Now, in addition, if I want to do a square root, I can say my square root, and let's say I want to square root the number of 25. Well, I can say 25 asterisk asterisk 0.5, and that'll actually square root my number. And this has to do with mathematical exponent rules, where the square root is really raising a number to the power of 1/2. And for example, the cube root is an exponent raised to the power of 1/3. So that's just something to keep in mind, because it is very nice to be able to use a decimal here, because there's no automatic, there is no built-in operator for a square root. So using exponents and then 0.5 is the best way to do that. And you can see if I print out my value, my square root, you can see that my value 5.0 is printed, which is the square root of 25. Now you'll notice here also that the type of a square root when it is completed is also a float. So that is something to keep in mind, that when you are doing if you're raising anything to the power of an of a float, the type will be a float. And that works with all of these as well. For example, and I'm just going to create a new cell here for this. Let's say I were to do 8 plus 7, right? This gives me 15, but if I did 8 plus 7.0, my answer will be a float. So if any of the numbers you use in your calculation are a float, then your overall answer will automatically be casted or converted to a float. All right, and now there's one final operation, which is one that you probably may not have heard of. All of these others you've probably used in math before, but one that you may not have heard of at all, or at least heard it with the official name, is modulus, or modulus division. And this, I'll write it out. And now the operation for this is the percentage symbol. Now, what does modulus division mean? Well, modulus division is essentially dividing two integers, but the value that it gives is actually the remainder of the division, not the actual value. So for example, if I were to divide, so I say div1, if I were to divide 9 and 5, you'll see that the value it gives me, let me print out div1. You can see that the value that it gives me here is 1.8, right? This is the overall answer. But what if I just want the integer of the remainder of the division, meaning that whatever is left over, what is the remainder? And so I can change this. I can now say mod and set this equal to 9 modulus 5. And if I were to print out this value, you can see down here that it gives me 4, because 5 goes into 9 one time with 4 as the remainder. So modulus division is useful actually in many cases within computer and data science. It is slightly more specialized. Of course, you'll be using all of these the common operations such as addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, exponents. You'll be using that a lot more frequently, but it is very important to at least be aware that modulus division exists, because there are many cases where this will actually come in handy. And it might even be possible that later in this series we might make use of modulus division. All right. Now the last component that I want to talk about are compound assignment operators. Now what does this mean? Well, this is actually going back kind of to the concept of modifying variables, but tying it together with arithmetic, right? Because let's say I had this here, new passengers. I wanted to take the number of passengers and subtract it by 2, right? Here I actually saved it as a new variable. But what if I actually wanted to modify this existing variable and subtract 2 from it? Well, in this case, we can use a compound assignment operator, which is simply taking the arithmetic operator, which is in this case subtraction, and combining it with the assignment operator, which is the equal sign. So in this case, if I were to take my num passengers here, and I were to print this out, you can see that it gives me that there are 30, because here I actually modified my value. So what I can do is I can actually run this cell again, and then run this cell. And now you can see that my number of passengers is back to 300 because I deleted the line of code where I modified this value. So now it's back to the original. And now that I have this as 300, but I can actually modify this in the same way that I went up here and I just changed my value. But instead, I can now use my compound assignment operator. I can take minus and the equal sign together and then put 2 here. And now if I run, or if I were to now print out, and I guess what I'll do is I'll actually put this in a separate line. So I'll put this here, right? And I were to actually print out this value, you'll see, well, I should now print num passengers. You can see that my value is, well, okay, I ran this twice. I'll run this again. So this is, I'll go back up here. So now it's back to 300. Right here. And now if I were to run this, you can see that my value is modified to 298. This is subtracting my value by 2 and then setting that as the new value. That is what the compound assignment operator does. It modifies an existing value by a certain number. So for example, in this case, number of passengers, I subtracted 2. So now my new value for the variable is 298. Now I can do this with addition. Let's say 4 new passengers book. I can say num passengers plus equals 4. And now if I were to print out this value, you will see that it is now 302. It took my previous value, 298, added 4 to it, 302, and then saved it back to the original variable. So in this case, you're overwriting the original value of the variable. However, you are modifying it before you do that. So here, I just took my original value, 255, and I changed it to 300, right? There was no math involved. But in this case, what if I actually wanted to, do some operation, add 2, subtract 2, multiply by 2? You can do that using compound assignment operators. So let's say I wanted to divide this by 2. I can say num passengers, divide equals by 2, and then print out my value. And you can see that now it gives me 151.0, right? Because it took my value and divided it by 2. Maybe this plane was flying during the Thanos snap or something and half the people disappeared. But in this case, you can see now that my value is 151. And now also you see that it has been changed to a float, because again, when you're doing division, it changes your value to a float. And so you can use any of the following compound assignment operators. Plus equals, you can use minus equals, you can use multiply equals, you can use divide equals, you can use, I believe you can use the exponent equals, and you can also use modulus equals. So definitely this is a great way of being able to modify variables and kind of tying it in with the math that we did here. Now also one thing I do want to note, and this is very important, so I'm going to put this all the way at the top here, that when we do arithmetic, we use order of operations. We use order of operations. So for example, if I take a value, so I'm going to go down here and I'm going to add a new cell below this. Let's say I had some math, so I say math is equal to, and I had 8.8 times 2 plus 3, just like that. And let's say I also add with parentheses 2 plus 2, or 2 times 2. You can see that if I were to run this, well, I have to actually print my value, so let me do that. It gives me a value of 24.6. It follows order of operations. It's going to do parentheses first. So actually, I will simplify this in a comment for you. So here, in the parentheses, 2 times 2 will equal 4, just like that. And then 8.8 times 2 will equal 17.6, I believe. 17.6. And then it's going to add 3 to it, so this will be 20.6, just like that. And then 20.6 plus 4 will equal 24.6. So very important, math follows order of operations. So just like how you would in normal math and code, order of operations are followed. And that is, of course, very important, especially when we start writing more complex formulas or when we are working with data science where we're actually doing more numbers and calculations. It is important to keep in mind that order of operations is still there and it is still our friend. All right, everyone, that is it for the third video. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure that you like and subscribe for more content. Make sure to follow CADS on Instagram and join our Listerv if you haven't already for the most up-to-date information. And see you all in the next one.